Good evening. We're continuing to get late information tonight about the terror attack today in Barcelona, Spain, as well as some kind of police operation that's going on, according to Spanish media right now, with 4 fatalities about 75 miles south of Barcelona. This is different than what happened earlier today. We'll bring you all of that throughout the next 2 hours as we learn new information. But we want to begin tonight with President Trump, who tonight has members of his own party questioning his moral authority, his competence, even his stability. And those are not our words. As you'll see, they are the words of GOP lawmakers. Just last night on the program, CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein said something pretty shocking about what his sources were telling him.
I think there's considerable evidence that there is a consensus developing in the military, at the highest levels, in the intelligence community, among Republicans in Congress, including the leaders in the business community, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is unfit to be the President of the United States. And that's the undercurrent. I've talked to you about it for weeks that I've been hearing in Washington. There is increasing talk about his emotional and mental stability, as David Gergen referred to earlier. This is extraordinary. It's a dangerous moment in our history.
Extraordinary and dangerous, he said. Well, this afternoon, Senator Bob Corker, a Republican from Tennessee, who at one point was said to be under consideration to be President Trump's Secretary of State, said this about the president's fitness for office.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. And we need for him to be successful. Our nation needs for him to be successful. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat.
Well, Senator Corker's remarks came just hours after the president rage tweeted about South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. Quote, he said, publicly seeking Lindsey Graham falsely stated, or publicity seeking Lindsey Graham falsely stated that I said there was moral equivalency between the KKK, neo-Nazis, and white supremacists, and people like Ms. Heyer, meaning Heather Heyer, who was murdered in Charlottesville. Such a disgusting lie, the president tweets. He just can't forget his election trouncing. The people of South Carolina will remember. Now, it's true the president didn't specifically say that Heather Heyer was on the same moral level as the KKK or neo-Nazis, whom he did speak against on Monday. But keep him honest, the very next day, Tuesday, the president revealed clearly his true feelings about the demonstrations in Charlottesville, saying very clearly that there were many similarities between Nazis, racist protesters, and those protesting against them.
There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
On both sides, sir? You said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame, yes. I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me, they didn't put themselves down as you, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Fine people on both sides, blame on both sides, violence on both sides. If only we could talk to someone who was actually there. It's a shame we never talked to a reporter who was on the scene. Oh, actually, wait, we did. And when the president says that there were good people at this march, that they were quietly there to protest a removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, that not all of them were neo-Nazis or white supremacists, what do you think? Is that true?
No. Everyone who was there knew what they were doing. They were shouting, "Jews will not replace us." It was very well coordinated. They had an order to the chants. Like, there was no mistaking. There's no innocent person wandering up and accidentally getting involved in this.
So there's that. Still, the president today said he wasn't establishing a moral equivalency between the neo-Nazis and Heather Heyer. But he sure does seem to be pointing the finger at a lot of other counter-protesters who the president keeps incorrectly saying didn't have a permit to protest, unlike the Nazis, who the president likes to point out did have a permit. For some reason, the president always ignores the fact that the Nazis violated the terms of their permit. Another Republican senator, Tim Scott of South Carolina, also weighed in today with this criticism of the president.
What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happens. There's no question about that.
Senators Scott and Corker were not alone today. Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina said the president is misguided in his remarks about Charlottesville. The president pushed it further today, clearly seeing an advantage in trying to refocus his attention on Confederate monuments, saying, quote, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." He tweeted, "You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish." Also, he goes on, "The beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." So that was this morning. The president clearly seems to be trying to change the subject from his inaccurate portrayals of the Charlottesville tragedy onto some sort of culture war between those who support Confederate monuments and those who want to see them removed. Of course, the Nazis and white supremacists marching this past weekend were never really marching about a Robert E. Lee statue, but the president has seized on the monuments issue for what are clearly political reasons. By this afternoon, in the wake of Barcelona, he was back on the electric Twitter machine, advocating what, to any modern observer, would be a war crime. Quote, "Study what General Pershing of the United States did to terrorists when caught. There was no more radical Islamic terror for 35 years. Now, this is not the first time the president has talked about this alleged moment in history. The president spoke about it fondly several times during the campaign. Listen.
They were having terrorism bombs just like we do. And he caught 50 terrorists who did tremendous damage and killed many people. And he took the 50 terrorists, and he took 50 men, and he dipped 50 bullets in pig's blood. You heard that, right? He took 50 bullets, and he dipped them in pig's blood. And he had his men load his rifles, and he lined up the 50 people, and they shot 49 of those people. And the 50th person, he said, "You go back to your people and you tell them what happened." And for 25 years, there wasn't a problem, okay? 25 years, there wasn't a problem.
So back then he was saying it was a 25-year solution. Now he's saying it's a 35-year solution. Anyway, keeping him honest, historians say what the president is actually referring to, General John Pershing's handling of a moment in the Moro Rebellion in the Philippines in the early 1900s, did not happen. Did not happen. So that's one thing. For another, if the president is somehow offering this made-up story as an example of what he would like to do today, that would be called a war crime. So where does all this growing criticism from Republican lawmakers leave the president and his agenda? New polling from CBS News shows that even though 55% of Americans disapprove of how he handled the tragedy, he still enjoys strong support, 67% among Republicans. Joining us is David Gergen, Nia Malika Henderson, and David Chalian. David Chalian, I mean, those words from Senator Corker questioning the president's stability, his competence, how significant is that coming from someone who's not only a Republican, but is someone who's, been a White House ally and avoided criticizing the president?
It is significant, and yet I think we are going to have to separate out the kind of significance, because you just showed those poll numbers. Republicans overall are still with this president out in the country. That doesn't make Corker's break with him any less significant. It is incredibly significant. This is a man who doesn't really delve into the daily political to and fro. He's very much a workhorse in the Senate, and he is using language that we have not heard, never mind from the Democrats, any party. We just haven't heard somebody in government use this before. The key thing that I think is so significant here is that we are 2 days after, Anderson, that press conference. And it's 2 days later that Senator Corker and Senator Scott are making these comments. To me, if I'm President Trump, I look at that and say, I still have a problem to fix here.
Although, David Gergen, a lot of folks on Capitol Hill, Republicans who tweeted about how bad Nazis are or racism is, never mentioned the president's name. So, I mean, you have these two questioning the president's fitness to serve by members of his own party. But there's a lot of other folks on Capitol Hill who, though distanced themselves from what the president said, didn't make it an attack on the president.
That's absolutely true, Anderson, and many Republicans have not spoken up against the president, but they've also dodged speaking up on his behalf. I do think that, especially Senator Corker, his statements today represent one of the most significant breaks from allegiance to the president that we have seen in this entire saga. Bob Corker is not only chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, but he's one of the most respected senators in the country, and he carries enormous weight. He was being considered at one point for vice president. So there was conversation about him becoming Secretary of State. I think that Carl Bernstein and I have been trying to argue here, and Carl's been very forceful on this, that the issue of stability, the president's emotional and mental health, is going to become an increasingly important focus of this story, and should be. Because there is something about the president, the way he responds. If you look across the board, it's with so much anger and impulsivity and distrust and narcissism, that those are questions ultimately about the stability that Senator Corker has now put forcefully into play. And I think that's really important, along with the competence question.
Yeah, I mean, to hear the senator talk about, use that word stability, you don't hear people questioning the stability of the President of the United States every day.
Right, certainly not publicly, certainly not from a Republican. And remember, Corker is up for re-election in 2018, and we just heard the president essentially encourage a primary challenge for Jeff Flake out in Arizona. So I do think this is a significant and notable break. Maybe it says something about the way that some Republicans are going to try to run in 2018, sort of as mavericks in a certain way. But I don't think we know yet what this actually means for legislation and how they'll actually vote. Corker, for instance, had been in some ways critical of health care reform and repeal and replace efforts, but went along with what the president wanted to see and what Mitch McConnell wanted to see. When they get back from this recess, you're going to have debt ceiling, you're going to have budgeting matters. At some point, you're going to have tax reform as well. Does what Corker said and what some of these other senators have said, like Tim Scott, mean anything for how they'll actually behave in terms of backing Trump's agenda and the way that Mitch McConnell lays it out come the fall?
David Gergen, you also had the president, which we talked about, tweeting out today, study what General Pershing in the United States did to terrorists when caught. There was no more radical Islamic terror for 35 years. The president was referring to this widely debunked story of General Pershing dipping bullets in pig's blood to shoot Muslim rebels. He referenced the story as a candidate, but aside the fact that it's false, I'm not clear what exactly he's advocating here. I mean, he's the president of the United States. Obviously, in this day and age, what the allegation is would be considered a war crime.
I'm not quite sure what point he was making either, Anderson, other than you have to be. He believes that one ought to be brutal, that it makes no difference whether they're war crimes, frankly. What's really important is you put them down. His point was that Pershing did this horrific thing, and from a Muslim point of view, he put bullets into blood, which the Muslims just believe that if you're infested with blood, with pig's blood, that's sort of fatal for you. You're going to go to hell, not heaven. But I think what he was endorsing was a very strong-handed response to terrorism is the only way we're going to put this down. And by extension, some of the people who were in Charlottesville on the right, they had to use. His argument would be they were facing thugs, and they had to respond in a thuggish way, and we all know that's not true. But I think that's his worldview.
David, do you agree with that? That it's sort of there is a linkage there?
I don't. I think this tweet was really about terrorism, and it was after Barcelona. It was in the news. I do think David is right, though. I think what Donald Trump is doing here is less take his words literally and more just be brutal and tough at all costs, and damn be political correctness. That is the place that he's in right now, and that's the argument he went to go make in the Trump Tower lobby on Tuesday. In his mind, it was just enough with this PC nonsense. This is a way for him to go and try to fortify his base, his most core base of support.
Neil, go ahead. Neil.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say he's always lionizing the past, right? Sort of lionizing a general in this case, and this sort of brute masculinity and force. And he does this a lot, I think, particularly on the matter of terrorism, right? He's talked, for instance, about taking families out of terrorists. He suggested that. He's talked about torture and saying that actually worked, even though people don't believe that worked in terms of forcing confession. So I think this is classic Trump. I mean, there he was in front of that audience, and they were cheering on with this very kind of visual, notion about pig's blood and these generals. So I think that's what he's up to. He always has this sort of nostalgia for the way things used to be, and this idea that in some ways generals and people and Americans have gotten weaker, and part of that weakness, as David said, I think has to do with sort of political correctness and liberals and the alt-left, and he is the one who's going to sort of restore the old order. I think that's what he's getting at in many ways with this fable.
Yeah. Malika Henderson, David Gergen, David Chalian, thank you. Just